Hi and welcome to this episode of Chatter Overflow. In this episode we're going to be talking about pen testing, firewalls, passwords, encryption and vulnerabilities and what they are. This will be really handy for a lot of people, however I know it's going to be quite good for those who are studying computer science at GCSE. It should cover part of that course for you. So first thing is, what is a vulnerability?
So, you will hear people talk about risk, threat, vulnerability, use them in different senses. So what we're going to do is really quickly explain them to make sure we're all on the same page. So the risk is the possibility that something bad may happen. The threat is the bad thing that may happen. And the vulnerability, which is what we're really talking about today, what vulnerabilities are and how you can try and prevent them. The vulnerability is the weakness that the threat may take advantage of or seeks to take advantage of. So risk is potential for damage if a threat takes advantage of a vulnerability. And if you want to delve into that a little bit deeper, we did explain this in a bit more detail in a previous episode of Chatter Overflow. So we'll include the link, however we do that. Yeah. And you'll be able to see us explain risk, threat, vulnerability and threat actor by way of an analogy where mosquitoes are the threat actors.
Best holiday ever.
It was work.
It was work, actually.
It was work and holiday.
Yeah. Right, so shall we start with the simplest bit, which I think is passwords?
Yeah, right, because they're simple.
Well, they shouldn't be. That's the point. They shouldn't be simple.
True. Okay, yes. I see what you did there. Passwords. You don't want to have a simple password, but at the same time, I bet we all wish that password management was simplified. So I guess I'll explain a way that we make it, or we handle it as simply as possible. So passwords. Passwords are super important and many people find them super annoying, but they're really important and they are worth paying attention to. It is worth spending some time to make sure you have good passwords, because passwords protect your online accounts. They protect your devices. It can be like your laptop, your computer, your phone, your tablet. They're really important because they are basically the key that protects those things. And so if someone gets the key, they can get into your accounts, they can get into your devices, unless you have multi-factor authentication, which adds another layer of protection. But we're not talking about MFA right now, we're talking about passwords. It's important that passwords are not a known word or phrase. So you'll hear talk of not using kind of a dictionary word or a known phrase. And this is because if you use something that's known, it's easier for both a person and a computer to guess. So if you use your favorite football team, if you use your dog's name, if you use, a well-known phrase, then people who know you or who get to know you over social media and information you share can potentially compromise your accounts by guessing your passwords. But at a broader scale, cyber criminals use password cracking tools and scripts with dictionaries of passwords in. And those dictionaries aren't just dictionary words, they're known words and phrases. There'll be bands, there'll be game names, there'll be books, all sorts of things that are known that people often use for passwords will go into these dictionaries that are then used in password cracking. It's really important also that you use a different password for each account, because if you repeat passwords, if the password gets compromised in one place, say you're using it for social networking, a particular social media site, and that site potentially maybe doesn't store it as securely as they should. So say cyber criminals are able to steal it from there for that site, but you're using it also in other social media sites, you're using it for your email, anywhere else where you're reusing it, they then can potentially access. So it's really important that you use complicated, random passwords and that you do not reuse them. Use a unique one for each account. How do you do that? Well, the best way, or one of the best ways we believe, is with password managers. Password Manager is basically like a vault for your passwords. So you use one password. Make it long, make it strong, make it complicated, because it is the password protecting all of your other passwords. So your other passwords are then in there. The Password Manager can generate new passwords. It stores all of them. If you need to share your passwords, which sometimes people do, even though a lot of people in security will say never share a password, well, sometimes people do with their family. Sometimes they do legitimately, for work. You might have a team that all access a social media account, for example. They need to all access the password. Well, Password Managers makes it easy to share them in a more secure way. Of course, what's the number one question when it comes to Password Managers?
What if my password manager gets hacked?
What if my password manager gets hacked? Yeah, we get asked that one a lot. It's a valid question. You're trusting them, so make sure you use one that's reputable. Make sure you use one that has been tested by the security community. So you can Google and find that out. Spend some time picking your password manager, but also recognize there is no such thing as 100% security. Wouldn't it be lovely if there was? No, there's not. So we pick the best solution available to us. And a password manager, those companies spend way more time, money, and effort on looking after your passwords than I guarantee you probably do. So they're much better than reusing weak passwords. Another option, which a lot of people in security don't like this one, but the tide's turning. People are starting to recognize that actually a solution can be to write your passwords down.
Yes.
You can. Yeah, of course you can.
With some caveats.
Yeah, there's some very important caveats to that. If you work in an office, don't write your passwords down and keep them in the office, because that probably is a violation of company policy. It's potentially going to get you in trouble. Probably not a good idea. Not very secure, because you don't know who's around you in the office. You don't know who's getting into the office. But for your home use, if you trust the people that you live with, then writing them down actually can be a really good solution. If you don't trust the people you live with, this probably isn't a thing for you to do. So do think about that. But recognize that it is way more likely that someone over the internet is going to break into weak password, accounts that are managed with weak passwords, than it is someone is going to physically break into your house and find your book of very complicated, strong passwords and use them. It's like you just weigh up risk in cybersecurity, and the latter is much less risky. Of course, if you're writing them down, make them complicated. But if you're not happy writing them down, if you feel uncomfortable with that, if you want to add a bit of security around it, what you can do is come up with a little code that only you know and write them down using that code. For example, you may decide that everywhere you put the letter C written down, it actually means it's an E in the password that you use. So you use a little cipher to add a little bit of protection when those passwords are written down.
I love the way that you have managed to perfectly segue into the next section.
It's just like totally natural.
Wow.
What do you mean? What's the next
section? The next section's
FC?
encryption. The next section's encryption. So let's talk about encryption and why it's needed and what it is. We're not going to get into the maths of it or any of that, but what is encryption? Encryption is basically when you take a piece of plain text or data and you mathematically manipulate it into a way that cannot be read in the original manner, right? So it's like, as you said, enciphering your password by changing letters, right? It's a very complicated version of that. Lots of maths involved. Very simple maths, but it's all lots of maths. So that's what encryption is. Why do we need it? Well, if you wanted to send a personal note over the internet, then anyone can break into that connection and see what that traffic is, what that traffic says, what that message is, which isn't very good if you're trying to send your credit card details across the internet, or send a secret note across the internet, or maybe some work emails. They all have to be encrypted. And we're seeing a lot more devices now that do that end-to-end encryption so that no one between those two endpoints can see any of that data. So that's the very high level version of encryption, what it is and what it protects against, which is people looking at your data. So unfortunately,
so it is protecting confidentiality.
Yeah, exactly.
And integrity.
And integrity.
Yeah.
So the next level that we need to talk about is firewalls. And firewalls, you may have heard this term, you may have heard about software firewalls or hardware firewalls. They're all the same thing, they all work the same way. But before we talk about what a firewall is, we have to understand how computers talk to one another. And they use a system known as ports. And this is a number of ports between 0 and 65535, right? So that many ports are available between computers to talk to each other. And so certain ports are used for certain types of chatter, right? So chatter overflow, right? So for example, port 80 is unencrypted HTTP traffic. Port 443 is encrypted HTTP traffic, right? The HTTPS. Port 21 is FTP, right? So for different ports, there are different protocols that talk over them. Now, for the first 1024, they're all kind of set. They're kind of normal. You can run these things on different ports. And that's called obfuscation. And basically, if I ran a web server on my IP address at port 80, almost everyone can find it. If I ran it on port 8000, not a lot of people will be looking for that, right? So that's one way you can kind of move and hide things. It's not a great way of doing security. So you can put a firewall in place, and a firewall basically allows certain ports to be seen, right? So I could basically, with my web server running on port 8000, I can say only certain IPs can come in and see that port 8000. Otherwise, you don't even get to see it. So it's a way of blocking communication between computers, or even allowing certain connections between computers. So that's what a firewall is, and that's what it protects against, is like unwanted attention or unwanted reading of certain data.
Yeah, cool.
Okay.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, there's no great segue into the next part.
Well,
maybe.
I might have one
a way.
actually.
Okay,
I'll give it a go. I'll see if I can do it.
Okay.
So I was going to add a little thing to firewalls.
Okay.
I was going to talk about a sort of concept that we've heard a little bit more in security in the last few years, which is the idea of a human firewall. So it's basically the idea that, you have your technical firewall, and then you have to recognize the importance of people in security, and this idea of a human firewall where people are a line of defense. And it's great, that in the last sort of few years, we've seen more people focus on people, on the importance of awareness, the importance of behavior, the importance of culture, the fact that cyber criminals target people arguably more than technology, and have done really for years, is really good. But Madeline, who works with us at Sygenta, she gave a great talk, and she's written a blog post on this idea of the human firewall. And she talked about actually thinking of people not as a firewall, but as human sensors, and people who, respond and identify issues and are really active in doing that. So we will share a link to her blog post because you should check it out. And I couldn't resist talking about that when we were talking about firewalls.
Yep.
So my segue is then talking about the fact that, it's not just about technology. We have to think about security in terms of different areas. And there's the people side. There is also the physical side. Physical security is really important. Why is physical security important? Physical security is there to protect against the fact that there are lots of vulnerabilities around how we store data, around access to that data, access to, places that hold the data. So physical security is very important. And of course, that's a super broad area. Physical security includes so much stuff. Locks, magnetic locks, as well as like padlocks and traditional kind of locks. We have CCTV, which is more kind of about surveillance, but of course it can have a security element, an active security element, depending on how the CCTV is being used, if it's being monitored in real time. There is, things like barbed wire, stuff like that comes into play when it comes to physical security. Identity badges. So, if I'm working in an office, people used to do that and may do that again at some point. But if I'm working in a place and I need to identify to my colleagues that I belong there, that I'm allowed to walk around, and as part of my ID badge there may be an access element to it, so I swipe it and I can get into places, but I shouldn't wear that when I'm not on site. If I go out, if I'm in the public area and I'm still wearing my ID badge, then people all around can see where I work, and they may be criminals around who think, I'm going to steal that badge, and then I can masquerade as that individual. I can get access. I can look more legitimate in the place that they go to and they work. So lots of stuff around physical security. What's really important is how it is configured and implemented, because people can think, well, we've got locks, we've got mag locks, we've got CCTV, we have gates up, we have doors that are really super expensive to get into our office, we have identity badges. People can think, well, we've done all the stuff, we've ticked all the boxes. But how you put that stuff in place is really important. And I would love you to talk a little bit about that in terms of locks, CCTV.
Yeah. So my speciality at Sygenta, other than computer hacking, is physically breaking into places, just to check that they are secure. Not to check, but to help them become more secure. Clients come to us. This is all legitimate. And so I see a lot of physical security mistakes and flaws, and how they're put in place. And the really important thing to remember about physical security is it's super important, because I can do all of the technical stuff to protect the data within my company. But if the physical security isn't there, and I have done this many, many times, you can literally just walk into a building and take the computers. And that circumvents millions and millions of pounds worth of digital cybersecurity. So physical security is super important, because if you don't have that going well, you don't have that configured properly, then it doesn't matter what you've done with the digital domain.
And there's a really great example of that, great/terrible, depending on the perspective you're looking at. A couple of years ago, I think it was in Malaysia, and a guy went into a bank. He was wearing Bermuda shorts, flip-flops, he had a rucksack, but he went in with a piece of paper, which is often a sort of social engineer's greatest weapon. He had a piece of paper, and he said he was there, I think, to test like their fire extinguishers or something. And the people in the bank were like, no, don't think so. You're not coming in, like, you're staying in the public area of the bank. You're not coming in to the kind of behind back office. And he just hung around. And he hung around long enough that he, I think, tailgated in, meaning someone came out from the back office, and before the door shut, this guy was able to sneak in, and hung around long enough that he could do the same to get into the safe. And he put lots of cash in his rucksack and he walked out with it. And he can be seen on CCTV, really calm, going up, having a nice chat with the security guard while he's got this bag full of money. I think it was about £100,000 that he'd got in the bag. So probably not as much as someone would potentially be able to steal if they were doing hacking, if they were stealing it digitally, but still he walked out with stacks of cash because of physical security issues. So the physical defenses they had in place were not enough to protect the vulnerability that he took advantage of being able to get into back office, being able to get into the safe and stealing that money. And the CCTV, which he could be identified on, was there as a passive thing. It was surveillance. Obviously, it wasn't being monitored real time. Otherwise, people would have seen what he was doing. But we have enough time for me to really quickly actually just talk about physical security in a couple of different elements as well, because there's lots of layers to it. Physical security, there is the element we have spoken about, the kind of physical security defenses. But we have to think about the fact that the internet has a strong physical component to it. The internet runs in cables. It comes into our countries in cables. So we have to recognize that actually there are vulnerabilities there as well. So we have to realize that security is not just technical. It has a strong physical element to it as well. And going forward with this explosion we have seen in Internet of Things, IoT devices, that brings a whole other physical security element as well, because a lot of us are introducing into our home locks that may be IoT on our doors, cameras into our homes, which we have seen cases of them being hacked. People use things like Alexa and, those other kind of speaker devices you can interact with, lights, kettles, fridges, all sorts of things that are internet connected, some of which may be great, some of which, I don't know, do I need my washing machine to be IoT? Probably not, but increasingly we're not getting much choice as consumers. So it's really important that we make sure they are secure. Often that comes back to the passwords. Often these IoT devices have default passwords. People buying them usually don't know that they need to change those default passwords, because going right back to what we talked about at the start, if you're using a weak password on something, it can be compromised. And we've seen some big cases. For example, the DDoS with DIN, or DINE, depending on how you want to pronounce it, which compromised IoT devices and was a huge attack that we saw a couple of years ago. So physical security, lots of different areas, lots of different ways that physical measures protect against the vulnerabilities that exist with the internet in general.
Yeah, right. So we've spoken about a couple of these things, but how do companies test that these things are configured correctly, done correctly? This is kind of like where Sygenta really work, right? Is this area of like sorting out whether or not you have, as a company, configured everything properly.
Yeah. So, absolutely.
Yeah. So
what you're talking about is pen
testing. Yeah.
So pen testing, there's different elements to pen testing as well. We can talk, so pen testing stands for penetration testing, and it's basically another term for hacking. It's just when you say hacking, too many people associate that with criminal hacking. There is, of course, a huge amount of hacking that is not criminal, and sometimes people call this pen testing as well. So that can be done digitally, but also you get physical pen tests. And then another thing we do is kind of tests of people, which is more looking at cultural assessments. It's more looking at awareness. It's more looking at the types of behaviors. But traditionally, pen testing talks about digital testing. It talks about hacking.
Yeah. So for example, if we go back to the firewall example, if a company puts in a firewall and they try and configure it how they think, it may not actually be working how they think it is. They may have a bunch of rules that says, don't let this in, don't let this in. And then right at the very bottom, and I've seen this many times, where they say, actually, if it doesn't fit any of these rules, just let it through. And so pen testing is basically a way of checking everything, checking every vulnerability that we can find that hackers would have taken advantage of in order to get in. So that's what pen testing really is about, is making people more secure.
Yeah, so essentially pen testing is about seeing actually how could we be attacked by criminals? What are the different ways that you, as a legal, ethical hacker, were able to get in? What can we do to protect against those to make sure that the criminals can't take advantage of them? So it's about finding vulnerabilities, identifying the kind of threat that could occur from those vulnerabilities being exploited, and then advising on the mitigations. Yeah. But there is also physical pen testing, and we've done that as well. And
that is basically trying to break into companies the same way that criminals would. Whether or not it's going through the window or walking in and doing the letter thing, as the guy in Malaysia did. There's all sorts of ways that criminals take advantage of physical security and digital security and the human element in order to gain access into companies. So that's what we're about, is doing that in order to create a more safe environment and more safe companies.
Yep, absolutely.
So, shall we quickly wrap this up?
Yeah, so hopefully that was helpful. Do leave us a comment. If you have any questions, then please, put your questions in the comments and we will try to answer as many as we can. You can find us on Twitter at SygentaHQ. You can find us lots of other places. Please do subscribe to the channel because we are keeping these episodes coming. There will be more Chatter Overflow in another couple of weeks and lots of other cybersecurity content, of course, coming your way via YouTube. Thank you so much for watching this episode of Chatter Overflow. If you've missed any of the previous episodes, then do go and check them out because there's all sorts of information in those, including our interview with Chris Ensor from the NCSC, which was fantastic.
Yep.
And I just want to emphasize the importance of understanding the different elements of cybersecurity, the fact that a lot of it, of course, is technical, but it's also physical, it's also human. It's an incredibly broad subject, incredibly broad field. So if you're fairly new to it and you're feeling a little bit like overwhelmed, that's normal. Yeah. There's a lot to learn. I'm really excited to say that I have a book coming out soon. It's going to be published in September. It's called Confident Cybersecurity because I want everyone to feel confident with their cybersecurity. And it covers everything we have talked about in this episode and a whole lot more.
Everything. It covers everything to do with cybersecurity.
It covers really a lot to do with cybersecurity, as much as one book possibly can. So we'll have a link to that as well. It can be pre-ordered now. So I hope you'll read it. I hope you'll enjoy it. I hope it will be helpful. And we hope that Chatter Overflow is helpful too. Thank you so much for tuning in and we'll see you again soon.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.